Alright, in the previous part, we looked at what the AI hype actually is and why it is happening. So now let's look at the reality and how we can use it to become sovereign individuals. The singularity is total bullshit, okay? Because it goes against the fundamental principles of nature, physics, biology, and even basic logic. The problem is that AI has become a religion for many people that do not understand these basic principles. This is a classic, how would you call it, Deus ex machina or the second coming energy that is shifted to some tangible but still delusional fantasy. From the original fanatics like Ray Kurzweil and Ben Goertzel, all the way to the current worshippers in Silicon Valley and the general public. Now, this is again tied to the concept I mentioned earlier in the previous article, actually, about the collapse of the West. I believe there is a part of the human brain that is responsible for hosting social and cognitive constructs of greater purpose, for example, like religion. But for most people that do not accept any religion, this gap is filled with something else. And for many people today, that is the woke Marxist and feminist ideology. But of course, for nerds and geeks, that is AI and the scientific or the sci-fi future that it promises. But does that mean that AI is a complete fraud? No, of course not. And there is definitely some progress, but the progress is evolutionary and incremental rather than revolutionary and exponential like it is marketed. It is comparable to how it was decades ago, basically. Machine learning is probabilistic software and has its amazing use cases. However, they are highly technical and require a lot of boring, repetitive work that is done by scientists and engineers to build these systems. And additionally, they require a lot of funding, infrastructure, and most importantly, the correct applications to have any real benefit. So, probabilistic pattern recognition is the main use case. That can be object detection through computer vision or context extraction through natural language processing. So, for example, LLMs are basically a numerical map of language itself. So, they pretty much solve the problem of NLP. And this is very impressive, don't get me wrong. This is highly impressive and also very useful. But they cannot think, these models, they cannot think, and they can definitely not reason. The main applications are, of course, like always with new technologies or with any technology, military and surveillance. And even if we look at the military use cases, it is not what most people think. It is not autonomous killer robots or even drones, but it is primarily about data processing and optimization. Because in the end, that is exactly what machine learning is fundamentally, mathematical optimization. There are many use cases like filtering sensor data, optimizing logistics routes, aid with target spotting and selection, and identifying threats, and many more, of course. However, these tools like computer vision and other detection methods, but also guidance systems, they have used machine learning for decades. The main new use case is the aggregation and integration of all data into one pool that is then analyzed for patterns. And the best example of that is, of course, Palantir. Now, what does that mean for us? Um, let's look at how we can use this to our advantage and look at three main relevant components. First of all, how do we protect our financial assets? The financial markets right now are almost entirely driven by the AI hype and unrealistic expectations. And because this whole hype is supported not only by big corporations and famous people, but also by governments all around the world. So, because of that, the hype can be pushed beyond what is normally possible. This means that timing of the market crash is especially now difficult to predict. However, I still believe that the crash will come quite soon. And because of that, I have eliminated all tech stock positions and also reduced holdings of overexposed indices like S&P 500 and especially the Nasdaq 100 because they are overexposed to tech and especially AI stocks. Now, diversification is still king, so I still have a position in S&P 500, but it is just reduced. And I also have increased my holdings in the energy sector, specifically in the S&P 500 energy, as well as individual trackers of oil derivative products like heating oil and diesel. Now these products have already gone up in prices since the start of the year, of course. However, I believe that the only way possible is up, considering all that is happening in the world, and additionally, because of the build out and the operations of all the data centers, that requires a lot of, like, a huge amount of energy. Aside from that, I'm also accumulating more gold and silver, especially since the last correction. And yeah, these precious metals are the fundamental hedge against instability and inflation, which I believe we will see a lot in the coming years. So yeah, definitely an important asset. And finally, copper might also be interesting to look into, as the build out of the data centers will require a lot of it. However, copper is not as scarce as many people think, so it's definitely not a priority that I would look at. Now, how do we protect ourselves against the control grid? Most likely, you have already put a lot of private information about yourself on the grid throughout years of social media usage, browsing, and having your smartphone with you everywhere you go. So, total anonymity or privacy is, for most people, not really possible anymore. However, what you can do is use the most prominent tactic in the age of information overload, and that, of course, is deception. So instead of trying to hide yourself completely, provide the information you want those in power to have about you. Use that to create a false persona so that your digital twin does not represent who you really are. I would argue that this is actually even more strategic than being totally anonymous, because total anonymity raises questions and makes you stand out. For example, when you have your phone with you, you can be sure that you are being tracked. So keep carrying it when you are going to regular locations like work or grocery stores to keep the pattern established. However, when you change your habits or add a new location to your life, then you should leave the phone at home or use at least a Faraday bag throughout the whole journey. As for search and software in general, now is really the time to give up convenience in exchange for taking back control. What this means is stop using Microsoft and Apple products and reduce reliance on Google as much as possible. If you still do have to use them, only do so for specific purposes or specific cases. You can use browser isolation for that to minimize your footprint. This means that if you use Google Chrome, use it only for Google and YouTube, and then use a separate browser for social media, for example, Opera. And then everything else you search for where privacy is actually important for you, then you should use a third browser like, for example, Brave or LibreWolf. And if you use Windows, delete it and install Linux, because mainstream distributions like Ubuntu or Linux Mint are now very easy and user-friendly to install, so you don't need to be technical. And as for smartphones, yeah, that's a whole other beast, because the best way to preserve privacy is not to have one, or at least, yeah, use a flip phone instead. However, of course, that for many people, including myself, that is usually not an option. So in that case, you can choose a privacy phone that does not have Google services or standard Android on it. Many people would argue that Apple is easy to use and is privacy focused because selling data is not in their business model. However, it is still a corporation that can change its strategy and business model without a second thought, or can be coerced by governments or infiltrated by intelligence agencies, which I'm pretty sure already happened, or even taken over simply by a method of equity accumulation or a partial hostile takeover. But basically, yeah, beware of relying on any big corporation. And finally, don't buy new cars that are filled up with screens and digital technology, because aside from poor quality, and many of those are actually really poor quality, but aside from that, they're also a direct surveillance tool. And then finally, as for the technology itself, we can use it to our advantage, but only if we use the right tool for the right purpose. And very importantly, always keep the cost benefit framework in your mind. So that means questioning, is the result worth the time and money you have to spend to get it? For example, LLMs should be used for what they are designed for, which is text processing and understanding. So summarizing large texts, finding the relevant context, writing emails, checking spelling, translating, basic search and knowledge extraction, those are the main use cases for LLMs. Considering they have been trained on a large portion of the internet and available books, they do contain a large portion of human knowledge. Just keep in mind that it is a supportive tool, but do not outsource thinking or decision making to it, because you will get bad to average decisions, but even worse, you will lose your own ability to think critically and independently. And again, use as little of the mainstream solutions as possible. If you are technically skilled or interested, then use privacy focused LLMs or self-hosted models, which is even better. But if not, make sure the information you provide and questions you ask are always anonymized or pseudonymized and stripped of any identifiable information or data about you. So even, like, this is important, even if the privacy policy states that they do not collect and analyze your conversational data, you can be sure that they do. All right, so this was it for this topic, and I will see you in the next one.